Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 89. How was the forgery of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife proved? So here's the story so far. I've been talking for a couple of episodes about the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, taking a kind of retrospective, looking from 2012 to the present day. What we looked at is how, first of all, the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, this tiny credit card-sized fragment, was announced to the world, and announced as something that was a 4th century text, a tiny fragment of a 4th century text that appeared to have Jesus mentioning his wife. A text that had just appeared in September 2012. There was a lot of fanfare. It was on major news stations and so on, and Harvard did a wonderful job of putting together a package of materials on its websites, including this lovely reproduction of the fragment itself. But as soon as that fragment was online, lots of people started to say, something looks wrong about this. And after only a couple of weeks, Francis Watson noticed that there was an uncanny resemblance between the lines on the Gospel of Jesus' Wife and lines in the Gospel of Thomas, as if they've been patched together. And then Andrew Bernhard noticed that these lines corresponded not just to the Gospel of Thomas, but to a very specific edition of the Gospel of Thomas, i.e. an interlinear of the Gospel of Thomas that had been edited by Michael Grondin. And most strikingly, the Gospel of Jesus' Wife copied over a typo that was in Grondin's Interlinear. Going from there, lots of us had thought that the case for forgery was pretty clear, but it wasn't universally held to be the view, and lots of people felt that there really were still signs that it might be authentic. And in particular, Harvard spent a lot of time doing scientific analyses, looking at the carbon dating of the piece and looking at the composition of the ink of the piece. And there were no real red flags in those studies that pointed to modern forgery. And this is sometimes the way with forgeries. Sometimes you have a good forger in terms of the material, and what you need to look at is not just the material but also the actual content. So while people like Andrew Bernhard were pointing to the content, Harvard were pointing more to the material reality, the material artifact. Although even there was a really important warning signal, which is that the papyrus was dated to the 8th century, and this is just so late given what the piece actually looked like in terms of the handwriting. The handwriting looked like it was a kind of 4th century Coptic hand, and here it was, apparently written on an 8th century bit of papyrus. That doesn't seem right. So some people began to say, could it be that a forger had written on an old scrap of papyrus, and of course the forger wouldn't have known what the dating of that papyrus was. Anyway, so that's the story so far, and Bernhard's work was read by some, but it was ignored by others. And it has to be said that there are elements to this story which are a little bit like a David and Goliath story, insofar as Bernhard was an independent scholar. He was somebody who was simply working with his good knowledge of the materials, not based in a university anywhere or anything like that. Though if you look at Bernhard's article in New Testament Studies, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, you would never know that he was not in a faculty position at some top research university. But anyway, we'll come to that in a little bit. Now, the Harvard website really added a whole load of exciting new materials in April 2014, when Harvard Theological Review wrote this whole issue defending the authenticity of the piece. And one of the things that happened when they did this is that they added lots of materials on the website that really helped scholars that were interested in this fragment, scholars like me. I mean, I just couldn't get enough of this at the time. I found it endlessly fascinating. Deeply troubling, but endlessly fascinating, as is often the way with potential forgeries. Now, one of the things that Harvard put online at this stage, for the first time, were 1 or 2 pictures of an associated fragment, a fragment of Coptic John. I mentioned this in the first of these episodes on the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, that the owner of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife also owned a Coptic fragment from John's Gospel. Now, that hadn't been released to the public, even though lots of us had been really, really keen to see it. And it still wasn't formally released to the public. But in a couple of the scientific reports on the Gospel of Jesus' wife, they did some work on this Coptic John so that you could get some kind of comparative data. And in that work, they had pictures of it. Not very good pictures, it has to be said. Not the lovely high-definition pictures that we'd got of the Gospel of Jesus' wife, but nevertheless, pictures that showed enough detail for us to be able to get some kind of analysis going on it. And what they showed was really, really striking, because it was very clear, very quickly, that Coptic John, this new fragment, which was only now being seen, was very clearly a forgery. There really was no question that this sister papyrus was a forgery. Now, here's the thing about this fragment of John that was now on the Harvard website. Christian Askeland, who's an expert on these things, looked at this and he could see instantly that there was a problem because it was written in Lycopolitan, a Coptic dialect that was already extinct by the 8th century, and this piece had also been carbon dated to this period. So Askeland said it's kind of impossible for somebody to be writing in this Lycopolitan dialect in this period, in the 8th century. It just doesn't make any sense. And what's more, it turned out that the text of John that was there was copied from a book that was published in 1924 by Herbert Thompson, which was a particular edition of a Coptic manuscript of John's Gospel. In fact, Askeland noticed that the line breaks in this Coptic John fragment, this Lycopolitan John fragment, exactly mirrored the line breaks in Herbert Thompson's edition. What's more, Herbert Thompson's edition was already on the internet. You could find it easily at archive.org. So once again, we seem to have a plausible case of a forger copying off the internet. Now, we're so used as professors to having this as a problem in our classrooms when students copy stuff off the internet. When we see fragments that are supposedly of ancient texts and they appear to be copied off the internet, our eyes do really come wide open, because it's very clear in these cases that this is not an ancient text. And it is as blatant as that. The forger had clearly been copying from an internet resource. This was not an ancient text. And as other scholars began to look at this material, they noticed other things. For example, there's a hole in this fragment, and the scribe has written around the hole. Now, this doesn't usually happen when you look at these kind of fragments. You usually speaking have a hole appearing after the writing's actually on the text. And if there is a hole present when the writing is going on to the text, the hole is present on both sides. And in this, the scribe has written on one side through the hole, on the other side round the hole. A hole cannot both be there and not be there when the scribe is writing. It was so suspicious. I actually put up a little graphic just to show how clear it was that Lycopolitan John was copied from Herbert Thompson's text. And I do want to make clear, I'm not claiming anything for myself in terms of discovery. I am not an expert on Lycopolitan. I'm not an expert on Coptic manuscripts of John or any of that. But I was able to see the blatantly obvious when it was pointed out to me, and I wanted other people to see the obvious as well, that this piece was very clearly a forgery. Now, it was written in the same handwriting style as the Gospel of Jesus' wife. It was owned by the same person that owned the Gospel of Jesus' wife. It was delivered to Karen King at the same time as the Gospel of Jesus' wife. So all in all, we have a very blatant forgery alongside another very blatant forgery. We have text written on 8th century fragments in handwriting that is from an earlier period. In both cases where we have a very obvious internet source for the forger to be doing their work. And there were other extraordinary issues as well. Like, if you looked at the possible size of the codex that this fragment would have to have been, it would have been absolutely enormous. This is one of the things that Stephen Emmel pointed out. It was a really implausible looking piece of codex fragment. So with this work going on, even those who had read Harvard Theological Review and had begun to say, well, maybe the text is authentic after all, they then began to say, well, hold on a minute. It really looks like the tide is turning again. Could it be that the Gospel of Jesus' Wife is, after all, a forgery? And what happens next is there are enough scholars who are willing to go into peer-reviewed articles to argue that the Gospel of Jesus' Wife and its associated fragments are very clearly forgeries. And it's worth underlining just how strong the work in these blogs was. And although I've been focusing on my own blog just because I'm telling this story from my perspective, I should give a shout out to things like the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog, which is where Christian Askeland was posting, and other amazing resources. James McGrath was posting on it. There was a great interview in the Jesus blog from Carrie Schroeder. I mean, there's really so much good stuff out there, and you can get links to all of these things when you look at my NT blog, if you're so minded to do that. But blogs are one thing, and ultimately you have to go to peer review. And this is what happened in the New Testament Studies, the premier journal in the field, in 2015. And there you had crystallized the work of Andrew Bernhard demonstrating that the Gospel of Jesus' Wife was dependent on Grondin's Interlinear. Christian Askeland wrote up his piece on Lycopolis and John. There was a great piece from Simon Gathercole and from Christopher Jones. There was an excellent piece by Yassine Robinson, someone who'd been writing about this right since the beginning, a very respected Coptic scholar. I mean, it was a really important piece, this New Testament Studies, and it was edited by Francis Watson, who takes us right back to the very beginning of the story. So in a way, it brings a kind of closure to this whole long episode about the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, with Francis Watson drawing lots of these materials together and commenting on them. And one might have thought at this point, I've said this a few times, but one might have thought at this point that finally you would have closure on the discussion of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife as forgery. And yet, there's always in this story an and yet. Still, it wasn't entirely accepted that the Gospel of Jesus' Wife was a forgery. Something else happened, though, that still looking back on it, I find myself flabbergasted about. And in fact, I reviewed the article just to remind myself, as I've done for all these podcasts, I've been rereading materials, and I actually used the word flabbergasted in a quotation in the Boston Globe. So this is the next bit of the story. You remember that right at the very beginning, in September 2012, there were 3 journalists who had special access to Karen King. One was Laurie Goldstein for the New York Times. Another was Ariel Sabar for the Smithsonian Magazine. More about him next time. And the other was Lisa Wangsness for the Boston Globe. And what began to happen is that these journalists who'd been involved from the earliest time actually revisited the story because it was still simmering away in such an interesting way. And Lisa Wangsness did some fantastic investigative journalism where she just talked to lots of the scholars that had been involved with this. And she got a fresh interview also with Karen King and had a conversation with her. Now, one of the things when she was talking to me for the piece, and to Andrew Bernhard, and probably others as well, I just happen to know that this is something that I said I remember saying, is I said that the thing I would most like to see of all is a piece that the owner of the fragment apparently provided originally at the time. Apparently the owner not only gave Karen King these materials like the Gospel of Jesus' Wife and Lycopolis and John and so on, but he also gave her his own translation, the owner's translation. Now, I was always interested to see this because a line was quoted from it very early on, And in the line that was quoted from it, it quoted something that wasn't actually in the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. It had Jesus said this. Now, when I saw the Jesus said this, I thought to myself, that is a little bit odd, because that's not even in the Coptic at all. I'll tell you where it is. It's in Grondin's Interlinear. He writes this in his Interlinear regularly. So Andrew Bernhard and I both wondered together, could it be that if we saw the whole of the owner's translation, we would have a very clear clue that the owner or some forger that had given it to the owner had copied from Michael Grondin's Interlinear. So Lisa Wangsness asked Harvard if they'd be willing to provide the owner's translation, and to our amazement, this is, like I said, I was flabbergasted. They said yes, and they published it on their website. And you know what? As soon as I looked at this thing, I remember walking back to my car and getting a text from Andrew Bernhard who said, Harvard have put this thing online, and I looked at it, and you know what I looked at? What I saw was that the owner's translation, so-called, was actually an interlinear. It was a line of Coptic followed by a line of English. It was in the exact format of Grondin's Interlinear of the Gospel of Thomas. And just to give an idea of how unusual that is, I think the only other Coptic interlinear I've ever seen is one of the Gospel of Philip that a guy did some years ago. It's really, really unusual to do that. And then as soon as we could see this translation, there were very clear points of contact with Grondin's Interlinear. This was no longer speculation. It was absolutely clear that whoever put this together was looking at Grondin's Interlinear. The Gospel of Jesus' Wife was composed on the basis of that internet source. There was simply no doubt about it. Now, Lisa Wangsness wrote her article in November 2015 in the Boston Globe. Is the Gospel of Jesus' Wife a revelation or a hoax? The article basically showed that scholarly opinion was shifting very strongly in the favour of forgery, but it wasn't completely there yet. There was still some people who held on to the possibility that the Gospel of Jesus' Wife was, after all, genuine. But that all changed. What happened is another of those initial journalists who had worked with Karen King back in September 2012, Ariel Sabah, who'd written at the time for the Smithsonian, he'd been doing his own investigative journalism, and his investigation took him all the way to the owner of the fragment and to a discovery about what lay behind the entire case. It's one of the most compelling pieces of investigative journalism you'll read, and that's what I'm going to talk about on the next episode of the NT Pod. Well, thanks very much for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. It's good to have your company, especially in these trying times. A big hello to my non-canonical Gospels class, to whom I'll be talking in person quite soon. That's just for them and not for other punters listening to the podcast, though, of course, everybody is welcome to listen in. And, of course, to send your feedback to me on Facebook at the NT Pod page there, to me on Twitter at Goodacre. You can find the NT Pod on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, anywhere where you pick up your podcast these days. I probably shouldn't go through it every single time, but there we are. Thanks again for listening. I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.